Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to our 12th DGAP morning briefing on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of the International Politik quarterly. Russian President Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine enters its 12th week. We are writing day 85 of this war. Fierce battles are continuing in the east and south of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army largely succeeded in pushing Russian troops further away from Kharkiv, and according to some reports, reached the border. At the same time, the battle over the Azovstal steelworks plant in Mariupol has been drawing to a close, with hundreds of defenders, many of them wounded, being evacuated to Russian-controlled territory. Meanwhile, the EU is still to finalize a sixth sanction package, including a phased Russian oil embargo, mainly because of Hungarian obstructionism. The idea to introduce punitive tariffs instead is being revisited by the US administration and may offer an alternative solution. Much attention, however, or most attention, has been focused on Finland's and Sweden's application to join NATO. The two countries, which are ending something of 80 or over 200 years of neutrality, respectively, have worked very closely together and orchestrated their moves. Official letters were handed over in Brussels yesterday. Finland's President Sauli Niinistö and Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson are due in the White House today. Their accession to NATO is likely to be relatively swift, even though there are objections on the part of Turkey. Russian President Putin, after initially warning of grave consequences, has signaled his acceptance. The step wouldn't make much of a difference. This, of course, calls into question the whole Russian rationale and justification for going to war against Ukraine, i.e. that the claim of NATO expansion was unacceptable and that the Russian aim was to wind back the clock to the 1990s and preferably push out the United States out of Europe. But to start us off now, please, let's turn to András.
Just like in the previous sessions, please allow me to share a map. As usual, we are going to use the map produced by the Institute for the Study of War. This is the military situation from yesterday. So the main focus of the fighting is still in this eastern salient of the Ukrainian positions in the Donbas region. Russia did not manage to achieve any strategic breakthrough. However, Russian forces keep advancing very slowly, meticulously, but still the advance itself is clear. Russia has significantly downscaled its ambitions regarding even the Donbas salient. Right now, it looks like that their main objective is to encircle and destroy Ukrainian forces defending Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So if you remember the beginning of the war, Russia had strategic scale encirclement plans, basically to cut off the whole Donbas from the rest of Ukraine. Right now, these plans have been downgraded considerably. They try to cut off this very eastern edge of the salient. Ukrainian forces keep defending. However, particularly as the Russian offensive here at Popasna is advancing slowly, they are moving towards isolating these Ukrainian units here in the eastern edge, in the eastern corner, to an increasing extent. I'm quite afraid that in the upcoming days and weeks, we will see the situation of these Ukrainian units here to get a lot worse than it is today, and it's already bad enough. Other parts of the salient are relatively stable in terms of the dynamics of the fighting. Russia still hasn't managed to advance its positions south of Izium, also due to the very successful Ukrainian counterattack north from here at Kharkiv. And of course, from the military perspective, absolutely the news of the week is that, as Henning already said, fighting for Mariupol has been coming slowly and gradually to an end. Most of the defenders of the Azovstal plant have surrendered. Russia keeps continuing airstrike and artillery strikes against the facility, indicating that probably there are still some Ukrainian defenders who are inside and who refused to surrender. However, this is clearly just the very end game of the fighting for Azovstal. And one unfortunately needs to state fairly and clearly that the taking of Mariupol, the capture of Mariupol is a major victory for Russia. Dear colleagues, Mariupol has so far been the largest Ukrainian city captured by the Russian Federation. Before the war, Mariupol had a population of 450,000. So far, the largest Ukrainian city that the Russians captured was Kherson, but Kherson's population is more than 100,000 less. I mean, Kherson was something around 300,000. Mariupol is a lot bigger. And by the takeover of Mariupol, now Ukraine's isolation from the Azov Sea is full and complete. And because Mariupol administratively belongs to the Donetsk region, therefore, by Russian law, as Russia recognized the independence of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, as Mariupol de jure, according to Russian law, belongs to the Donetsk People's Republic, unfortunately, it's quite unlikely that Ukraine would be able to take back the city anytime soon. Just to give an insight into the situation in the city, how serious the destruction is, the plant Azovstal has been damaged to such an extent that it's clearly beyond repair. I mean, separatist leadership basically admitted it and declared pompous plans about demolishing Azovstal, what's left of it, and creating kind of a holiday resort in place of the plant. Well, good luck to that. According to Ukrainian administration from Mariupol, or the Ukrainian administration in exile, we have known before that 95% of the city's buildings have been damaged. Now the Ukrainian administration said that 65% of these damaged buildings is also beyond repair. So dear colleagues, basically Mariupol has been leveled. It's over, it's done. So if we take one of the Russian objectives to inflict as much damage to Ukraine as possible, well, the takeover of Mariupol has been a success also from this perspective. Good news, even though now the siege is over and the Russian units so far bogged down in Mariupol could be theoretically free to be moved anywhere else, most probably they won't. I mean, the Russian units fighting in Mariupol are largely a spent force. They need rest, replenishment, repairs, basically several weeks of regaining their combat readiness. So from this perspective, the defenders of Mariupol really fulfilled their task. For 82 days, they managed to bog down significant Russian troops. On the peak, it was like 15 battalion tactical groups. And these 15 battalion tactical groups could have been very useful for Russia on other sections of the front line. In the long run, it's quite likely that the defense of Mariupol will become part of the Ukrainian heroic narratives. These people will become similarly heroes of Ukraine, like defenders of the Donetsk airport in the beginning of the war. So this was really an outstanding performance with a bit of self-reflection. I have to admit, a few weeks ago, you remember it very well, even I didn't think that these people will be able to hold out and fight so long. This has been really exceptional. Now it's coming to an end. What's happening on other sections of the front line? The Western front line is stable. Russia has minimal forces there. Out of the 92 battalion tactical groups fighting now in Ukraine, Russia keeps only 7 in the Kherson-Mykolaiv region. So there, Russian forces are able to hold the front line, but not doing much else. More concerning is, if we focus out a bit, more concerning is here what's happening in the Zaporizhzhia region. Most of Zaporizhzhia region has been already occupied by the Russian Federation, and Russia yesterday declared that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which has been taken over by Russia in the beginning of the war, from now on, the Zaporizhzhia power plant will belong to Russia and will sell electricity to Ukraine. Dear colleagues, this is robbery in strategic scale. So it's not just taking over cities, villages, and plundering a few agricultural machinery depots. It's basically plundering a power plant with 5 reactors. So this is something large scale. The only good news in this Zaporizhzhia, basically Russian declaration, the only good news that this declaration also counts with an existence of an independent Ukraine in the long run. Still, last thing from my side, so far there seems to be no progress with the so-called referenda planned by Russia on the separatist territories. They try to organize one in Zaporizhzhia, they try to organize one in Kherson, they try to organize one in Mariupol. However, it's yet still undecided in what exact way would Russia try to legitimize, quotation mark, to legitimize its control over the occupied territories. So all in all, battle is going on. Ukrainians are largely holding their positions. However, the situation here in the eastern corner of the salient in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, it's likely to turn very bad for the Ukrainian forces quite soon. So that's it from me for the beginning. Thank you again. And if you have any questions, I'm trying my best to answer them either here or in the chat. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, András. First questions are already flooding in on the chat function, but maybe allow me one quick question, which last week we were sort of thinking about and worried about whether Russia would sort of mobilize more troops. There have been some reports about sort of a silent mobilization of people who have sort of somehow sort of military experience, people in their 30s, maybe 40s even. Can you say anything about that?
Yes, silent mobilization is going on. This is not mobilization in the legal sense. There is no pressure or force involved. Russia is trying to convince people to voluntarily return to armed service. They are trying, mostly those people who have recently left the Russian armed forces, either as professional or career soldiers, who are still yet relatively young, who have had a professional career, who have had real military experience, preferably also mission experience, and who have left only a few years ago. So they still remember what they have been doing. Because these people would require only kind of a minimum training to just refresh their skills, and thereafter could be deployed to combat. There is information that around 3,500 of such reservists are already ready for deployment. Russia is trying to recruit a lot more. Meanwhile, any kind of forced mobilization, let it be partial mobilization or particularly full-scale mobilization, does not yet seem to be on the Russian agenda. Partial or full mobilization would be impossible without declaring a state of war, and Russia has apparently not been ready for that so far. With this silent mobilization, even though slower than with the general one, even with this silent mobilization, they might be able to raise 10 to probably even 20, 25,000 soldiers in a few months' time. And Russia has clearly been preparing for a prolonged conflict. So right now, particularly as Ukraine has also extended the state of war until the end of the summer. Right now, it looks like that this war is going to go on at least until the end of the summer, which means that Russia has basically enough time, from their perspective, to conduct and keep on with this silent mobilization. So that's where we are.
Let's move on to Kristi now for her perspective on the very likely prospect now of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, maybe as soon as late summer. Kristi, please.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to join the discussion. And it's also a pleasure to have, for change, a bit more positive aspects of what is going on. As you all know, Finland and Sweden submitted their application to join NATO just yesterday. And in Estonia, we are not trying to hide our enthusiasm about it. It's obviously a major improvement for security of the whole Baltic Sea region. And actually, for the first time ever in history, we will have the Nordic and Baltic states all part of the same collective defense arrangement. So it's also historical in that sense. We have all been in the same security environment next to a difficult big neighbor and always trying to test and try different ways to manage the threat. But now we will be doing it together. And obviously, it will be much easier for NATO to defend the Baltic states. The accession of Finland and Sweden will give the strategic depth which has been missing thus far. It will also create finally the situation where we can actually have a better strategic balance in the region between the Russian and NATO military forces. And of course, as it has been stressed from the Finnish and Swedish side, their decision is not against anyone. The aim is not to weaken Russia's security. And it's important to stress once and again that NATO is a defensive organization. It does not have any aggressive intentions against Russia. But obviously, we know that Russia does not like the enlargement of NATO, and this very deeply seated attitude in the Russian thinking stays there, that in order for Russia to feel secure, they think they need to control and dominate their neighbors and have some kind of sphere of influence. And this is the kind of root cause of tensions in Russia's relations with its neighbors. None of them really wishes to be part of the Russian sphere of influence. Countries want to have their sovereign right to choose. And unfortunately, Russia has not found a formula to establish a more healthy basis for good neighborly relations with independent small neighboring countries. But now let me also share some reflections on how I see Finland's and Sweden's NATO accession as part of the bigger changes going on in the European security architecture. And there are five factors I would like to highlight. What is new? Of course, we are still in the middle of huge changes, and the old security order, or the post-Cold War security order, is clearly broken. So one thing that is going on now is the elimination of gray zones, because they have proved to be unstable. This idea to have some kind of buffer between Russia and the West, and the Western idea that by not having military presence of the West close to Russia's borders, we could have more stability and security in Europe, has proved untenable. Sweden and Finland have drawn their own conclusions. Ukraine has drawn its conclusions. So Russia will take control over what it can, and the neighboring countries of Russia, if they can, they try to anchor themselves as firmly as possible to the Western security structures. The second changes we are seeing the emergence of a hard border again between Russia and Europe. I'm hesitant to use the concept of Iron Curtain. There are still differences between today and the Cold War era, but it can be called a hard border in many senses. We are going to have, and that's likely to be the situation for many years to come, increased military presence on both sides of the border. We will have heavily reduced and constrained interaction across the border, be it economic exchange or people-to-people contacts. And also a very important factor is the contrast and competition between the totalitarian system in Russia on the one side, and then the free democratic countries in Europe trying to defend their values and their political system. The third factor is that we don't have a shared understanding with Russia on the European security order. This has been visible actually for many years, but the clearest expression was the demands that Russia presented in December last year. And now finally, I think everyone in the West has to recognize this reality that there are fundamental disagreements between Russia and the West in how we would like to structure and define the principles of European security order. I believe with Putin's Russia, it doesn't make sense even to try to negotiate on a new shared understanding. And we just have to kind of accept for the time being living in this antagonistic relationship where the common agreement is not there. But at the same time, and this is the fourth factor, is that the Western structures are strengthening. And obviously Finnish and Swedish NATO accession is a good example of that. Both NATO and the EU are today stronger than still a couple of months ago. So we have this Western security architecture strengthening and consolidating as a result of the war in Ukraine. And then my final point is that one lesson learned, it's not really a new factor, but it's a reinforced understanding in certainly northern parts of Europe, is that the wish to keep the US involved in our regional security is very, very strong. We need the US involvement, and while Finland has been one of the strongest proponents of developing EU defense in the past years, by now applying to NATO, Finland is actually kind of acknowledging that the EU does not provide comparable security guarantees. And while we still, I believe the countries in the region continue to also contribute to EU security and defense policy, I think the division of labor between NATO and the EU will become even clearer than thus far. And it's important to keep this complementarity between the two organizations and develop their cooperation accordingly. I will stop there. Thank you.
Christian, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Henning. And also thanks to Kristi for giving the first initial perspective from the region and what it means. I can only echo that. Maybe there are 2 points which are interesting to notice from the German side. Why we have heard a lot about bad escalation over the last weeks in Germany and the fear on that, we now see that the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO is not seen as an escalation or as a good escalation. So there's an ambiguity that we have here, because Germany, on the one hand, is bound to its institutional logic, where more cooperation in institutions is a good thing. At the same time, the incoherence between what is happening and what is happening in Ukraine, putting pressure on the Russian security conception, and now it's happening with Sweden and Finland is also putting pressure on the Russian security conception, is not a coherent policy line, you could argue, for the moment. And I guess this is something where we will see behind the scenes, but then later on with regard to the NATO summit in June, how Germany will behave on these things and try to reconcile the different lines on that, because there needs to be some strategic thinking be put into this, and how do we basically respond to the things. So in principle, from a kind of security policy perspective, I would say one could argue that Finland and Sweden don't change very much of the balance on the geostrategic outlook, because the countries have been there, they have been integrated into the European Union, they have been closest non-allies but partners to NATO ever before, so they have been part of the planning, etc., etc. But there's no change in the military balance for the moment. So there are no new forces, and I guess a lot of things will depend on how the Russians will react in future and how they can react in future on what the exact challenges to Germany and to NATO will be. Our bigger challenges are the 2 things, which are on the one side, the changing reality, which is the European security order, a lot of things Kristi and András described before, and reconciling this with the national policy conception or prescription, which is Zeitenwende. So basically, how do we respond to the change of our security environment is still up in the air. And partial answers may be given by just filling our commitments and fulfilling our commitments to NATO, where the national discussion about the 100 billions are to a certain extent helpful, if we can keep the line on that. I guess this already will help to a certain extent also in the cooperation with Sweden and Finland. But of course, there are, with special regard to Sweden and Finland, there are other questions that come up now from a German point of view. On the military side, it's about intensified cooperation, not only on small items, but on larger procurement issues, but also on the question of, for example, in-service support of the Finnish armed forces if they would have to go to war. And the principal decision of, are we going to stay in a forward defense conception that we currently, or that some are proposing, or are we going to swing back to a certain extent into a deterrence mode, which has significant implications for the force posture and for the positioning of forces, not only in Finland, Sweden, Norway, but also in the Baltic countries. And I guess this is a discussion that currently we are largely happy not to have, because there are some very thorny questions coming up here. Early signs currently coming from the government are, one division per Baltic country is too much. There needs to be some more meaningful, although there is no assessment so far on what the military threat from Russia towards the Baltic countries and the Nordic region will be in the future. But the Germans are already hesitant and saying, don't provoke the Russians again. So here we are back to the question of incoherence of our national security and also European security conception on the military domain. And I guess there will be a lot of discussion towards the NATO summit, as I said, of to what extent can the Baltic countries, but also the Nordic countries, persuade Germany that a more forward-leaning, not forward-present, but forward-leaning approach of Germany is necessary, with possibly also pre-positioning of material, not forces, but especially material, because this is the biggest challenge. The good thing, I guess, about the accession directly on the regional strategic scenery is a much better control of the Baltic Sea and a more kind of neutralization of the St. Petersburg harbor and the Kaliningrad region. So there's better things that how we can operate in the future. And the big question mark, I guess, is first step, how will the Russians either reshuffle their military response to that, or should we expect a reconception of their overall security policy? Because I mean, what Kristi just said, I think it's striking, because the current security conception has been unsuccessful. The idea of bringing chaos or control over others into it didn't work out. So the question is, how will Russia respond? Not that we have to fear the response, but we should be aware that there is still a dynamic in what we will see in the future, and it's good to be able to respond to the Russian reconception of their security in the near future, once the Ukraine war has come to one or the other end. Not pre-proposing anything of that. So interesting times up for us. NATO discussion for the moment in Germany still underdeveloped. A great welcome on the institutional side that we are growing the institutions, with a little bit of denial of what it means in terms of military responsibility from Germany. That's the outlook in the future already. Thanks.
Let's go into the Q&A section now. Please raise your hands if you have got questions. But while you're sort of doing that, let me just sort of put two questions from the chat to our panel. The one is sort of the likelihood of Turkey sort of somehow delaying, maybe even blocking the accession of the two countries to NATO. Kristi, maybe what's your sort of your take on that? Difficult maybe to predict at the moment, but maybe just a hunch. And another suggestion here by Graf von Waldersee, asking whether it would make sense to sort of combine the accession of the two countries with sort of an offer towards Russia, with sort of proposing confidence-building measures in the north of Europe, in the Arctic. Maybe Kristi first?
Well, actually, I want to react quickly first to something that Christian said, because it's such a key issue in the German debate. This idea coming back again that we should not provoke Russia. Let's think about our German military role in NATO through that prism. And there is really, from our point of view, a fundamental problem in this approach. I mean, Russia has been provoked to act aggressively in its neighborhood where there has not been sufficient defense and deterrence capability there. Whereas when you have the force that can stop Russia, then you also are less likely, much less likely to have aggressive behavior. So this is the whole idea of deterrence and defense, that you want to prevent conflict. NATO has this very important role in creating stability by preventing conflict. And now that Russia has taken this aggressive approach to this idea of re-establishing a sphere of influence, we need to react by making it very clear that there is no point in even thinking about testing NATO, that NATO is able to respond strongly, and that's why it's necessary to strengthen the presence in the Baltic states. Of how we think about managing the Russian threat, where we are having the argument, I think, with the Germans, and on a more general level, if we in the Baltic states had been always thinking about not provoking Russia, we would not be independent, we would not be in the EU, we would not be in NATO. So unfortunately, Russia feels provoked and even maybe humiliated if it does not control its smaller neighboring countries. But this is something then that we have to fight against and make clear that it is not acceptable to us that Russia does not respect the sovereignty of its neighbors. But then on Turkey, just very quickly, it requires some diplomatic, political effort that Turkey would in the end block NATO enlargement. So that's the very, very short answer. And then relations between NATO and Russia in the context of Finland and Sweden joining, as long as Putin stays in power and the war in Ukraine continues, there is no space for the kind of dialogue that we have been trying to have in the past decades. I think Finland has also said it very clearly, actually. And I'm sure Finns would be certainly willing to look for new openings with Russia and return to a more normal relationship when the conditions again. But right now we are not in such a situation.
Thank you very much. The line was a little bad, but I understand you expect this sort of Turkish objections to be overcome by diplomatic means. And yeah, thank you very much. Christian, do you want to jump in? Otherwise, we have four.
Very, very quickly. Very good points by Kristi. And I guess we need the continued help from our friends to challenge the German reflex, which is on the no escalation. We have come too close to Russia, blah, blah, blah thingy. Because the escalation thing is the unwillingness to really manage conflict. So the Germans don't want to go into a conflict and don't want to lead the conflict. That's our basic problem. So that's why we call it, we want to have peace conception, the peace order, blah, 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 blah. Not realizing that many of our partners and allies are currently in a conflict with a direct border to conflict. So we need your help on these things now and for the next 4 years, because it's an old habit that we are having here. On the Turkey thing, I fully agree. Don't want to comment on that. On the thing, on the idea of security and confidence building measures, yeah, sure. I mean, but it always takes two to tango. So I think the offers have always been on the table. There's the ability to re-establish all the things in the OSCE that we had there that have been suspended, etc., etc. On that things, the door is open to the Russians if they really want to negotiate, not only talk. And I think that makes the difference if there can anything come out of it. But the idea of halting improving our security by making these arguments, this is the biggest risk, to say we shouldn't, we shouldn't kill the early spring flowers of a potential agreement on security and confidence building measures by building up our military. This will be the German argument on these things. This is not acceptable to our allies and can therefore not be acceptable to us, I would say. I guess some people in the government have a different line on that.
Thank you very much, Christian. Let's go to take a first round of questions. Who wants to go first? Maybe András, picking up on the last one?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Ginsburg. The answer is indeed yes. So since the beginning of this war, Belarus has become, a de facto belligerent. Short of sending combat forces to Ukraine, Belarus is doing everything to support Russia's war against Ukraine. And unfortunately, it's quite likely that Russia will keep stationing combat-capable fighting forces in Belarus even in the long run. So far, Belarus has been able to resist the stationing of Russian combat forces in Belarus, but this position started to weaken from 2021 on. And right now, it's quite likely that Russia will upgrade its military presence in Belarus. It will not have only военные объекты, so military objects, but also kind of real bases. And the assets Russia is, let's put it like this, is quite likely to deploy to Belarus is long-range air defense, S-400s, also Sukhoi 30 fighters, and also Iskander missiles, which we all know are nuclear capable. So this will alter the security policy calculus both of Poland and Lithuania regarding particularly the Suwalki gap, and because of the strengthened Russian A2AD potential, it will of course make it harder for NATO to secure safe airspace to and from the Baltic states in case of an all-out conflict. So yes, the importance of Belarus for Russia's security and defense policy is likely to grow.
Many thanks. Kristi.
First, this big question of whether Trump or someone like him will return and what that will mean for European security. Of course, in eastern parts of NATO, we are very much aware of this possibility. There has been a lot of thinking done about it, and it is a prospect that we have to take seriously. And of course, the only way really to respond to it is or to prepare for it is for Europeans to do more for their own security. And this has been the mantra that we have been hearing for so many years, and still with quite limited steps taken by Europeans thus far to get serious. So now it looks like this is finally changing, that this is one of the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that many European countries are seriously strengthening their defense capabilities, including Germany. But obviously this all will take time. It will not strengthen Europe's ability to defend itself overnight. So for many years to come, we will still have this dependence on the US for our security. But I also want to make an additional point. I mean, for the Baltic states or Poland, or I would also say for Finland, Sweden, the Nordic countries, it's not like a goal in itself for Europe to be independent of the US. Of course, would be much better for Europe to have stronger capabilities and kind of to be able to act on its own in different security, in defending different security interests. But the war in Ukraine is just another example of a situation where we have this major conflict in Europe, and our sense is that the way the US is approaching the situation and kind of seeing the European security and finding ways to push back Russian aggression is closer to our thinking than what we hear from our allies in Germany and France. So it's not that the US is imposing anything on us. On the contrary, I mean, we just think more alike the US than with some of our European partners. And then very quickly again on Turkey, I don't want to comment on the Finnish and Swedish positions on Turkey. I'm not an expert on that. Just on this issue of Turkish-Russian relations, I'm quite confident that Turkey will decide on its position vis-à-vis Finnish and Swedish accession according to its own security interests and not according to what Russia would like the Turkish position to be. So that would be my take or my guess on this particular question. And I think A2AD I will leave to others who are more defense experts. Christian can maybe pick up that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Christian, please.
I mean, on the A2AD, I think András has said already quite a thing. It's not a growing of capabilities, it's a kind of a reshuffling of them, possibly, sort of moving. But I guess here also we will still have to wait as to what extent a new NATO conception will more offensively take into account to take down or neutralize Kaliningrad and other areas. Like Belarus in the future, and what does it mean for capability development with regard to deep strike capabilities in Europe, be they air-based or land-based? That's something I would watch out for the next NATO summit, definitely, because this will be another game changer for the Russians if we would go into a significant capability of taking down the air defense from afar. Very quickly, only on the 100 billions and the US and so on and so on. I mean, the conditio sine qua non is filling your gaps, and we have plenty of them. The question of whether that helps us, so as we have a so-called single set of forces, whatever we put into the single set of forces will definitely help us as Europeans, because we are in debt to the Americans. The Americans have said quite long ago that they only want to provide 50% of the capabilities in NATO, which is their approach to fair burden sharing. And I would say that's okay. But we as Germans don't do. So first, delivering our capabilities will help us whether we are alone or with the Americans. Being without the Americans for the next 15 years is not possible without taking higher security risks. That's how it is. But the question of what do we need to do if we are without the Americans is a question of fine-tuning after we have filled the gaps, I would say. So that's really kind of doing the basic thing of being a good ally comes first, and then we can think of how do we optimize the capability portfolio and react to a potential American move out of the European theater again, because their priority on Asia hasn't changed, of course. At the same time, I guess they have realized, at least with this administration, that they can't afford a Europe that is unstable. And that's something which has been put into their equation. Whether that's the reality with the next president, we will see. I hope that helped.
Thank you very much, Christian. We have time for one more round. Thank you very much. And maybe I throw one other sort of question from the chat into the mix, which is sort of posing the question whether a NATO which is becoming larger and larger is not becoming weaker, whether you see this danger of sort of bigger is not always sort of more beautiful or more effective. Maybe you want to comment on that as well. But for a final round, maybe start with Kristi again.
Thank you. Yes, very good questions again. I mean, first on yes, whether Russia will play a diminished role in European security and what will be the role of northeastern neighbors of Germany. Yes, Russia will, of course, its influence will be weakened as a result of the current aggression. I mean, this is the outcome that we really are working towards to make sure that the aggressive behavior is not awarded. On the contrary, we have to make sure that this war ends in a way that is a strategic defeat for Russia. I do sense it today that the views of the Baltic states, kind of Eastern members of NATO and the EU, are heard more and taken more seriously. We still have differences between, like, among European countries, among EU member states, in how we see Russia, and I was talking about it before. So it's not an easy discussion we are having about how to actually adjust our approach to Russia, and I think some very big steps have already been taken or initiated that will fundamentally change the relationship to Russia. But it seems to be a very painful process, especially for Germany, and to have this go through this debate on what the Zeitenwende then actually means for German policies. And like two key questions is, one is this issue of military force. I mean, we are really expecting to see a much stronger contribution of Germany to the defense of the eastern flank of NATO, and also considering this possibility that maybe the US role will diminish in future. So Germany will really be a key actor, and huge expectations. And this is also then requires a change in the strategic thinking and strategic culture. And then the other thing is the economic and energy relationship to Russia. Again, we've seen this major change happening. We don't hear today anymore anyone arguing that having dependence on Russian energy would be somehow good for European stability, and that the gas pipelines would be peace projects, right? So there has been a big change, but it needs to be fully implemented. And Russia will always be a major factor in our regional security. It will not go away anywhere. So we will have to focus a lot on Russia. It's very unpredictable at the moment what the future will be and what kind of process Russia domestically will be going through in the coming years. So we do have to expect some instability there. But of course, the focus of our security policy in the Baltic Sea region be on Russia. And right now, unfortunately, it's not possible to have so it's an antagonistic one where the focus is then on defense and deterrence. But then on Sweden, yes, I know Finland much better than Sweden, but there is an obvious difference between the Finnish and Swedish NATO debates, and I have noticed this kind of pain in Swedish society in accepting the change in their security policy and giving up hundreds of years of neutrality. Will it create a wedge in Swedish society? Well, hopefully, of course, not. It has been a very short time for the debate, and that's one thing that many Swedes are uneasy about. But now it takes leadership and this kind of consensus building, which the Nordic countries are generally very good at, to kind of go through this change and make sure that there is sufficient support. Because in Finland, it's a very different situation. It has been an amazing overnight change, and now like very, very strong consensus behind NATO accession. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christian, we're almost out of time. But,
yeah, very short, possibly only 30 seconds. Very good question from Carsten Vogt I would like to respond to. I mean, I think you're right. What Finland and Sweden, because they're in a German, perspective, they are so much loved by us. Would bring us is more pressure and more ambiguity. So we may feel bad, or even worse in our feelings towards Russia, but the Russian narrative is so established in German politics and German economics that it will not go away. We will just feel more hardship about it. But I guess we will soon, and for the next decade, see the rhetoric on, but now it must be enough, and we must reestablish relations to Russia, etc., etc. So this will come back again, and Russia will make itself heard towards the German audience. as long as the security conception remains, and also kind of the overall policy conception remains the same. It will be a mixture between blackmailing and incentivizing, etc., etc. And there's some, independent of that, some reasoning for the Germans to take care. I mean, this is the biggest country in the world still, but it depends on the future political leadership of the country, of what is possible. And I think that is the important thing. What can we expect of future political leadership? Will it remain Putin? Will we have possibly a change in the government? Will those who back Putin for the moment say we are better off with a new president, and by that having a restart of relations with the Europeans and legitimizing reconception of our approaches, etc., etc. But as long as that doesn't happen, I guess we will just have to withstand all those offers, which are only lukewarm and look possibly towards splitting up the Europeans.
Very much. Next week is a public holiday. The Thursday is a public holiday in Germany, so we won't see each other then, but we are planning to have the next meeting in 2 weeks' time. Please look out for the invitation in good time. Please, well, first of all, I would like to thank you all for coming and spending time this morning, for your questions and comments. Please join me in thanking our 3 panelists who have been once again giving us a lot of new insights, at least to me. And with that, thank you all and a very good morning.